the most terrifying night of World War I. Night fell across the Western Front. The trenches became almost completely dark. Thousands of soldiers waited beneath the cold sky, listening to sounds coming from the darkness beyond no man's land. During the day, the battlefield was terrifying. But at night, it became something different. The darkness hid enemy movements. It made every sound seem closer. A soldier could hear footsteps without knowing who was making them. A flare could suddenly illuminate the entire battlefield. Then darkness would return. For the men living in the trenches, night was not a time of rest. It was a time of uncertainty. One of the most frightening experiences of World War I was the possibility of a surprise attack after sunset. The enemy could be somewhere beyond the barbed wire. Patrols could move silently through no man's land. Engineers could repair defenses. Snipers could search for targets. And soldiers could wait for hours without knowing whether an attack was coming. The Western Front had become a massive network of trenches stretching across France and Belgium. The front lines were separated by no man's land. In some places, the distance between the trenches was only a few dozen meters. In other places, it was much wider. During daylight, soldiers could observe enemy positions. At night, visibility disappeared. This created a new kind of warfare. The sound of war became more important than sight. Soldiers listened for movement. They listened for digging. They listened for footsteps. They listened for the sound of enemy artillery being prepared. A quiet night could suddenly become chaos. One of the most common ways armies illuminated the battlefield was with flares. A flare could rise into the sky and briefly turn darkness into daylight. For a soldier standing in no man's land, this could be terrifying. One moment he might be hidden. The next moment he could be completely exposed. Machine guns could immediately target movement. Artillery observers could report positions. The flare would disappear. Darkness would return. Then another flare might rise. This cycle could continue for hours. But darkness also gave soldiers opportunities. Small patrols sometimes crossed no man's land at night to gather information. They might crawl through mud and shell craters. They had to avoid barbed wire. They had to remain silent. A single noise could reveal their position. A patrol might spend hours moving only a short distance. The soldiers knew that discovery could mean death or capture. These patrols were often among the most dangerous tasks on the Western Front. They were not large attacks. They were small groups operating in darkness. Their purpose could be reconnaissance, listening, cutting wire, or identifying enemy positions. Sometimes soldiers returned with valuable information. Sometimes they did not return at all. The battlefield itself was dangerous enough. But the weather could make night operations even worse. Rain turned the ground into mud. Shell craters filled with water. Cold temperatures made movement difficult. Soldiers carrying heavy equipment could become exhausted quickly. And the darkness made it difficult to distinguish safe ground from dangerous ground. A shell crater could be several feet deep. A soldier moving too quickly could fall into it. Barbed wire could be almost invisible. The remains of destroyed trenches could create obstacles everywhere. Then there was artillery. Artillery was one of the most terrifying weapons of World War I. A soldier might hear a distant gun. Then there would be a pause. A shell could arrive seconds later. The explosion could destroy part of a trench. At night, the flashes of artillery created a terrifying landscape. The horizon could suddenly light up. Smoke would rise. The ground would shake. Then the darkness would return. For soldiers inside the trenches, there was often nowhere to escape. Deep shelters provided some protection, but they could also become dangerous if struck directly. Wooden supports could collapse. Entrances could become blocked. Men could become trapped underground. Communication was another major problem. Telephone lines were frequently damaged by artillery. Runners had to carry messages. During the night, finding the correct trench could be difficult. A soldier might become lost in the maze of communication trenches. The battlefield had no clear street signs. Everything could look the same. Mud, sandbags, wooden supports.
barbed wire,
smoke, darkness. One of the most frightening possibilities was a raid. Small groups of soldiers could attack enemy trenches at night. The goal was often to capture prisoners, destroy equipment, or gather intelligence. These raids could be sudden and violent. A group might cross no man's land under darkness. Then enemy soldiers would hear movement. Flares would rise. Machine guns could begin firing. Artillery could be called in. Within minutes, a quiet night could become a battlefield. The soldiers defending the trench had to react quickly. They could not always see the enemy. They relied on flares, sentries, and listening posts. A sentry standing alone in the darkness carried enormous responsibility. If he heard something, he had to decide whether it was a real threat. A false alarm could waste ammunition and alert the enemy. Ignoring a genuine attack could be disastrous. This constant tension created enormous psychological pressure. Soldiers could spend hours staring into darkness. They might hear strange sounds. Sometimes the sounds were caused by animals. Sometimes by artillery. Sometimes by the enemy. But there was no way to know immediately. The imagination could become almost as frightening as reality. Night also changed the way soldiers communicated. Whistles could signal orders. Flares could communicate information. Runners carried messages. Artillery units could receive coded instructions. The armies of World War I developed increasingly complex systems for controlling nighttime operations. But technology had limitations. Radios were still developing. Telephone cables were vulnerable. Aircraft could not always operate effectively at night. Much depended on human observation. This meant that a soldier's eyes and ears were incredibly important. In the darkness, experience mattered. Veteran soldiers learned to recognize sounds. They could sometimes identify different artillery weapons. They knew the sound of nearby movement. They could distinguish friendly flares from enemy signals. New soldiers often found the experience overwhelming. The trenches were already difficult during the day. At night, they became almost surreal. Imagine standing in a narrow trench at 2 in the morning. You are surrounded by darkness. Your clothes are wet. Your boots are covered in mud. You have been awake for hours. Somewhere across the battlefield, enemy soldiers are watching. You cannot see them. Then a flare rises into the sky. For several seconds, the battlefield becomes visible. You see barbed wire, shell craters, ruined trees, smoke. Then the flare disappears. Everything becomes black again. A distant explosion breaks the silence. Then another. Then another. This was normal life for millions of soldiers during the war. The night could also bring moments of unexpected silence. After hours of bombardment, the battlefield might suddenly become quiet. Soldiers would listen. Nobody knew how long the silence would last. Sometimes it lasted minutes. Sometimes hours. The quiet itself could become frightening because everyone knew that another attack might be coming. The Western Front was not one continuous battle every second. It was a constantly changing environment. There were periods of intense fighting. There were periods of relative quiet. But even during quiet periods, soldiers remained alert. The possibility of danger was always present. One of the most important tasks at night was repairing the trenches. Artillery and weather constantly damaged defensive positions. Soldiers had to replace sandbags, repair wooden supports, clear mud, restore communication trenches,
repair barbed wire.
These tasks were often carried out under cover of darkness because daylight exposed workers to enemy observation. The men repairing the defenses knew they were vulnerable. They worked quickly. Sometimes they worked under artillery fire. Sometimes they heard enemy soldiers nearby. The work had to continue because a damaged trench could become deadly during the next attack. Nighttime also affected medical evacuation. Wounded soldiers had to be moved through trenches and across dangerous terrain. Medical teams used stretchers. They searched for wounded men in darkness. A soldier who was wounded in no man's land might remain there until rescuers could reach him. Sometimes rescue was impossible. The darkness could protect medics from enemy observation, but it could also make finding wounded soldiers extremely difficult. Many men spent terrifying hours waiting for help. The emotional effects of these nights were enormous. Soldiers wrote letters describing exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty. Some tried to make jokes. Others became silent. Many simply focused on surviving one day at a time. The human mind was never designed to live under constant threat for years. Yet millions of men did exactly that. They adapted. They learned routines. They learned how to sleep whenever possible. They learned how to move through trenches. They learned to recognize danger. But adaptation did not remove the fear. The night remained one of the most dangerous parts of trench warfare. As World War I continued, armies developed new tactics and technology. Aircraft began operating more effectively. Artillery coordination improved. Searchlights were used in some areas. Machine guns became more mobile. But darkness remained difficult to control. The battlefield belonged to whoever could observe, communicate, and react faster. The terrifying nights of World War I were not always remembered through one famous battle. They were remembered through thousands of smaller experiences. Patrol that never returned. A flare illuminating enemy soldiers. A trench collapsing under artillery fire. A sentry hearing footsteps. A wounded man waiting in the darkness. A group of soldiers repairing barbed wire while shells exploded nearby. These moments rarely appeared in official histories. But they were part of the everyday reality of the Great War. When the war finally ended in November 1918, millions of soldiers returned home. Many had spent years living through nights like these. They carried memories that were difficult to explain to people who had never seen the battlefield. The trenches eventually disappeared. The barbed wire was removed. The shell craters slowly filled. Villages were rebuilt. Fields became green again. But the memories remained. The terrifying nights of World War I were not defined only by explosions. They were defined by uncertainty. The fear of what might be waiting in the darkness. The knowledge that the enemy was only a short distance away. The knowledge that a flare could reveal your position. The knowledge that one sound could bring an attack. And perhaps most frightening of all was the silence. Because in the trenches of World War I, silence never guaranteed safety. Sometimes it simply meant that something was about to happen. That was the reality of night on the Western Front. A world of darkness, mud, smoke, and uncertainty. A world where soldiers waited for morning, knowing that the next day could bring another battle. And when the sun finally rose over the trenches, it did not always bring relief. It simply revealed what had happened during the night. For millions of soldiers, that was life in World War I. And for many, those nights would never truly end.